The Saturday afternoon sun was spilling across the living room rug, making dust motes dance in the golden light. It was supposed to be a happy light. This was our special family project time, an idea Dad had after seeing a birdhouse kit at the hardware store. "This'll be fun," he'd said. "Something we can all build together." The pieces were spread across the rug, a puzzle of pale, splintery wood that smelled like sawdust and glue. My older brother, Jake, who was 12, was the master builder. He had already assembled the main walls and was holding them together with a focused frown, his hands surprisingly steady. He worked with a kind of loud confidence, making everything seem simple. "See? It just fits," he'd say, even when it didn't. My sister, Sophie, who was 10, was the artist. She sat with a little hum in her throat, her legs crossed neatly, painting the two separate roof pieces a brilliant sunny yellow. Her brush moved with a dancer's grace, each stroke smooth and perfect, leaving no streaks behind. She made it look like the wood had been born yellow. And then there was me, Chloe, 8 years old. My job was the window. It was a tiny, delicate square of wood, no bigger than my thumb, with 4 even smaller panes. It was meant to be the final, charming touch, but it refused to fit into the slot that had been cut for it. I had been at it for what felt like hours. I turned it clockwise, then counterclockwise. I tried pushing it in gently from the top, then from the side. My fingers felt clumsy and thick, like I was wearing winter mittens. I kept picturing the little bird family that would live inside. A mommy bird and a daddy bird, and their tiny, fluffy babies. They would need a perfect window to look out of. I didn't want them to feel a draft. I remembered Dad's warning from the start. Be patient with these kits. If you force the pieces, they'll just snap. So I was trying to be patient. I was trying so hard. I kept picking up the instruction booklet, a confusing map of thin lines and numbered arrows, trying to see the secret I was missing. Jake glanced over, a smear of wood glue on his cheek. He let out a short laugh, not a mean one, just a brother laugh. "Chloe, you're still on the window? Seriously? We'll have the whole house built and painted by the time you get that one piece in." My cheeks burned with a familiar heat. "I'm just being careful," I mumbled, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't want to break it. That's when the sigh came from the armchair. It wasn't a soft sigh. It was a loud, heavy sound, like the whole world was tired. It was Dad. I had almost forgotten he was there, watching us over the top of his newspaper. I looked at him, my heart doing a hopeful little flip. I thought maybe he would defend me, tell Jake to let me work at my own pace. But his eyes weren't on Jake. They were fixed on me. His brow was creased into that deep line that always made my stomach feel like a wobbly bowl of jelly. His mouth was a flat, unhappy line. "Chloe," he said. His voice wasn't yelling. It wasn't even angry. It was something worse. It was heavy, like a wet blanket, and filled with a weary disappointment that felt 100 times sharper than shouting. "You make everything harder." The words dropped into the sunlit room and shattered the light. They didn't echo, but they hung in the air, thick and suffocating. For a split second, everything stopped. I saw Sophie's hand freeze over her perfect yellow roof. I saw Jake's fingers pause their gluing. The happy hum and the confident building were gone. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed for them. Jake cleared his throat and went back to his work. Sophie gave me a quick, sad look before dipping her brush back into the paint, her eyes now glued to her own task. The world started moving again, but I was left behind, frozen in place. My eyes fell away from my dad's face. I couldn't bear the disappointment there. They fell past the half-built birdhouse that was no longer fun, and they landed on the swirling patterns of our old, worn rug. I found a dark brown swirl that spun around and around, a tiny maze that led to nowhere. I stared at it. I didn't cry. I didn't argue or try to explain that I was only trying my best, that the piece was tricky, that I was following his own rule about being patient. The words were stuck in my throat, a hard lump that hurt to swallow. I just stayed quiet, letting the silence be my shield. I wished I could shrink down, get smaller and smaller, until I could disappear completely into that brown swirl on the floor, where everything wasn't so hard. The silence I was hiding in didn't last long. It was a thin, fragile thing, and my dad broke it with a clearing of his throat. "Here, Chloe, let me see it," he said, his voice softer now, but still carrying the edge of impatience. He walked over and knelt on the rug, his knees making a popping sound. I didn't look up, but I felt his shadow fall over me. Without a word, I held up the tiny, stubborn window piece. My hand was trembling just a little. He took it from me, his large, grown-up fingers looking clumsy around the delicate square. You just have to find the right angle, he murmured, more to himself than to me. He tried to slide it into the slot. It didn't go. He frowned and tried again, wiggling it this time. It still wouldn't fit. I could feel Jake and Sophie watching, a silent audience to this new little drama. I kept my eyes on the rug, praying for the floor to swallow me whole. I wanted him to see that it was hard, that I wasn't just being difficult. For a moment, a tiny, hopeful part of me thought he might say, "Oh, you're right, this is a tricky one." He might apologize. Instead, his sigh came again, shorter this time, but just as heavy. With a final, forceful push of his thumb, the window piece popped into place. But it came with a sound, a tiny, sickening crack. I finally looked up. The window was in, yes, but a small splinter of wood had broken off the frame. It was a tiny flaw, one that no one else might ever notice. But I saw it. It was like a little scar on the face of our birdhouse. "There," Dad said, standing up and brushing his hands together as if finishing a difficult chore. "See? All it needed was a firm hand." He looked at Jake and Sophie. "All right, let's get this finished before dinner." He didn't look at me again. He didn't seem to notice the crack. Or if he did, he didn't care. He had solved the problem. He had made the hard thing easy. And in doing so, he had proven his own point. I was the one who had made it harder than it needed to be. The rest of the project went quickly. Jake glued the roof on, and Sophie touched up the yellow paint, carefully avoiding the new window. I just sat there, a few feet away from them, hugging my knees. I was no longer part of the we, I was just a spectator. When it was all done, Dad held it up for inspection. "Great job, team," he said, smiling at my siblings. "Jake, you're a natural builder. Sophie, that paint job is beautiful." They beamed under his praise, their faces bright with pride. The birdhouse looked lovely, a cheerful yellow and brown home, except for the tiny, cracked window that only I seemed to see. They decided to hang it on the big oak tree in the backyard right away. Sophie carried the paintbrush, Jake carried the hammer and nail, and Dad carried the birdhouse. I trailed behind them, my feet dragging through the grass. I watched as Dad hammered the nail and hung our creation on a thick branch. It looked small against the big tree. Dad put his arms around Jake and Sophie's shoulders. "The birds are going to love it," he said proudly. I stood apart from their little circle of celebration. The sun was starting to set, and the cheerful yellow of the roof was turning a muted, dusky orange. To me, it didn't look like a happy home for a bird family anymore. It looked like a monument. A little wooden reminder hanging in our backyard of the day I learned that I was the one who made everything harder. I stayed quiet, watching them, until my mom called us in for dinner. The whole way back to the house, I could feel the jagged edge of that cracked window in my mind. The words followed me. They weren't loud anymore. They had become a quiet, constant whisper in the back of my mind. At school, they sat on my shoulder during class. My teacher, Mrs. Davison, had a kind face and always encouraged us to ask questions. "There are no silly questions," she would say. But my questions now felt silly. They felt hard. One afternoon, she was teaching us about caterpillars and how they turned into butterflies. She asked the class, "Can anyone think of why a caterpillar needs to build a chrysalis? What's the chrysalis for?" My hand twitched. I knew the answer. We had read a book about it just last week. The chrysalis was like a safe, hard shell that protected the caterpillar while it was changing, because its body turned into a kind of goo before it became a butterfly. The word goo made me smile. My hand started to lift, wanting to share this fascinating gooey fact. But then the whisper started. "You make everything harder." What if I explained it wrong? What if Mrs. Davison had to correct me? What if the other kids got confused because of me? It would be so much easier if someone else answered. Someone like Emily, who always used the right words. I pulled my hand back down and tucked it under my leg. I looked at my desk. A moment later, Emily's hand shot up. She explained the chrysalis was for protection during metamorphosis. Mrs. Davison smiled. "Exactly, Emily. Wonderful." I felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. I had avoided being hard, but I had also disappeared. It was the same at home. Homework became a mountain I was too scared to climb. There was a math problem with 3 parts, and I got stuck on the first one. Before, I would have scribbled in the margins, trying different ways to solve it, and if I was really stuck, I would have gone to Dad. But now, the thought of approaching him with a problem made my stomach hurt. I could already see his face, the tired sigh, the look in his eyes that said, "This again?" So I just stopped. I stared at the numbers. They didn't make sense. My brain felt fuzzy. Instead of trying and getting it wrong, I just left the space blank. When Dad checked my homework later that evening, he tapped the empty space. "Chloe, you didn't finish this one." "I didn't get it," I said quietly, my eyes on the table. He sighed. It was the same sigh from the living room. "You have to try, Chloe." But I had tried. I had tried so hard not to bother him that I ended up not trying at all. He didn't understand that. To him, the blank space was just another way I was making things harder for him. Even playing wasn't the same. I used to love drawing big, complicated pictures full of castles and dragons and entire families of bears having picnics. Now, my box of crayons felt intimidating. I'd start to draw a tower and the line would be a little crooked. Before, it was just a crooked tower, maybe one that a clumsy giant had built. But now, it was a mistake. A flaw. I had made the drawing harder to look at. I would feel a wave of frustration, my cheeks getting hot, and I'd crumple the paper into a tight, angry ball and throw it away. My wastebasket started filling up with failed castles and lopsided trees. Soon I found myself only drawing simple things I knew I could get right on the first try. A perfect sun in the corner of the page, a simple flower with 6 identical petals, a stick figure family where everyone was smiling. They were easy. They were boring. They were safe. My silence began to build a wall between me and my siblings. Jake, who was always in motion, would burst into a room with a new idea, a new game, or a new half-told joke, and I would just stare at him. I couldn't find the energy to jump into his fast-moving world anymore. One afternoon, he was building an elaborate fort out of blankets and chairs, a masterpiece of household engineering. "Chloe, I need you to be the guard," he said, his voice muffled from inside the structure. "You have to stand by the door and shout if Mom or Dad comes. It's the most important job." A year ago, I would have loved that. I would have puffed out my chest, grabbed a toy sword, and marched back and forth with serious purpose. But now all I could think was, what if I don't see them in time? What if I'm looking the wrong way and the whole fort gets discovered? It would be my fault. I would make the game harder. "I don't want to," I said from the couch where I was flipping through a picture book without really seeing the pictures. Jake's head popped out from under a blanket. His face was full of confusion. "Why not? It's the best part." "I'm just tired," I lied. He shrugged, his enthusiasm deflating like a popped balloon. "Okay, fine, Sophie, you can be the guard." Sophie, ever agreeable, put down her doll and took up the post. I watched them play from a distance, feeling a pang of loneliness so sharp it was like a stomachache. I was on the outside of their fun, looking in through a window I had built myself. Sophie was gentler. She seemed to sense the shift in me, even if she couldn't name it. She would try to draw me back in quietly. "Chloe, do you want to play dolls with me? We can make up a story for them." We used to spend hours creating intricate lives for her dolls, full of drama and adventure. But now, even that felt like a test. What if my story was boring? What if my doll said the wrong thing? So I'd agree, but I'd be a passive player. My doll would just nod and agree with whatever Sophie's doll said. "Is your doll feeling shy today?" Sophie asked once. Her head tilted as she looked at me. "Yes," I whispered. It was easier than explaining the truth I didn't have words for. Soon, Sophie's invitations became less frequent. It wasn't as fun to play with someone who was barely there. The wall around me was getting taller. My dad and I drifted even further apart. Our interactions became a series of careful, quiet moments where I tried to be as small and easy as possible. When he'd come home from work, Jake and Sophie would run to him, clamoring for attention, showing him drawings, telling him about their day. I would hang back, offering a small, quiet, "Hi, Dad." He would smile at me, but it felt distant. "Hi, Chloe Bug. Everything okay?" I would just nod. How could I explain what was wrong? The problem was me. He was the one who had pointed it out. Telling him would only make it harder for him. So I would nod and he would accept it, turning his attention to the louder, easier demands of my siblings. I learned that my silence was a relief to him. It was one less thing he had to deal with, one less problem he had to solve. The birdhouse stood outside on its branch, a constant silent witness. Sometimes I would see a sparrow or a finch land on the perch, peek inside, and then fly away. None of them ever stayed. None of them ever tried to build a nest. It was as if they could see the tiny crack in the window frame from all the way out there. As if they knew that the house, for all its bright paint and careful construction, was flawed. Just like me. The turning point came on a gray, rainy Tuesday. I woke up to a house that felt too quiet. Usually, Mom's voice was the first thing I'd hear, a cheerful song she'd hum while making breakfast, or a gentle, "Time to get up, sleepyheads." But that morning, there was only the sound of rain drumming against the window panes. When I got to the kitchen, Dad was making toast, his movements jerky and angry. He spread butter on the bread with so much force that it tore a hole in the middle. Jake and Sophie were eating their cereal in a stiff, uncomfortable silence, their eyes fixed on their bowls. Mom was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Mom?" I asked, my voice small in the quiet room. Dad didn't look at me. "Your mother isn't feeling well. She's staying in bed. Just eat your breakfast." But it didn't feel like a normal sick day. When Mom had the flu, she'd still call out to us from her room. This silence was different. It was sad. Later, as I was getting my backpack ready, I walked past their bedroom and saw the door was cracked open. I peeked inside. Mom was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to me, but I could see her shoulders shaking. She was crying. Dad was standing in the doorway. "Helen, we can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low and strained. "It's not good for the kids." "I just need some space, Mark," she replied, her voice thick and wet with tears. "Just, please." Dad stood there for a moment longer, his hand on the doorknob, before closing the door with a soft click. He walked away without seeing me. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding. Mom was sad, and Dad couldn't fix it. In fact, it seemed like he had made it worse. The whisper in my head came back, louder than ever. "See? Even Dad makes it harder sometimes. Stay away. Don't get involved. You'll only make her sadder." For the rest of the day at school, I couldn't focus. I couldn't stop picturing my mom's shaking shoulders. I knew what it felt like to be so sad you wanted to be invisible. When I got home, the house was still wrapped in that same heavy quiet. I went to my room and sat on my bed, listening to the rain. I felt a powerful, aching need to do something. It was a feeling so strong it was like being thirsty. I had to help her. But what could I do? The fear was just as strong. Every idea felt like a risk. A drawing? What if she didn't like it? A hug? What if she wanted to be left alone? Then I remembered what Mom always did for me when I was sick or sad. She would bring me a special cup of chamomile tea with a spoonful of honey, in my favorite blue mug. A mission formed in my mind. It was a secret, and it was terrifying. I tiptoed to the kitchen. The house was empty. Jake and Sophie were at their after-school clubs. It was now or never. I pulled a chair over to the counter and carefully climbed up to get the blue mug. My hands were shaking as I took it down. I found the box of chamomile tea bags, the one with a picture of a sleepy bear on it. The kettle seemed like a bad idea. It was heavy and hot and dangerous. I remembered Dad telling me never to use it alone, so I made a decision. I would use warm water from the tap. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be warm. Holding the mug with both hands, I filled it carefully from the faucet, making sure it wasn't too full. I put the tea bag in and watched it float on the surface. Now came the hardest part, the journey to her room. Every step was a new challenge. I kept my eyes locked on the water, watching it slosh near the rim, my whole body tense with concentration. Don't spill. Don't make a mess. Don't make things harder. I reached her door and nudged it open with my foot. She was still there, sitting on the bed, staring out at the rain. She looked up, startled, as I came in. Her eyes were red and puffy. I held the mug out to her with both hands. It felt as heavy as a boulder. "I made you some tea," I whispered, my voice trembling. She just stared at me for a moment. Her eyes went from my face, full of fear and hope, down to the blue mug in my hands. Then, her expression completely changed. The sadness didn't disappear, but something else bloomed in her face. A look of surprise, of wonder, of overwhelming love. The corners of her mouth trembled into a watery smile. "Oh, Chloe," she breathed. She reached out and took the mug from me, her fingers brushing against mine. She didn't say the tea was lukewarm. She didn't point out that there was no honey. She just held it to her chest as if I had just handed her a precious jewel. She patted the spot on the bed next to her. I crawled up beside her, and she wrapped her free arm around me, pulling me into a tight hug. The hug felt warm and real. "Thank you, my sweet girl," she whispered into my hair. "This is the best cup of tea I have ever had." We sat there for a long time, me tucked into her side, the gray light of the rainy afternoon filling the room. The warmth from her hug felt like it was melting something hard and cold that had been lodged in my chest for months. She held the mug of lukewarm tea like it was the most precious thing in the world, taking a small sip every now and then. The silence in the room was no longer heavy and sad. It was soft and safe. Finally, she broke it, her voice a gentle whisper. "You've been so quiet lately, my sweet girl," she said, stroking my hair. "It's like you've been hiding from us. Is everything okay?" The question was so kind, so different from the tired impatience I had grown used to. that the words just tumbled out of me before I could stop them. I don't want to make things harder, I mumbled into the fabric of her sweater. I try not to, but I always do. I felt her stiffen slightly. She pulled back a little to look at me, her brow furrowed, but not with anger or disappointment, with concern. Chloe, honey, what do you mean? Who told you that you make things harder? I couldn't bring myself to say it was Dad. I didn't want to cause another fight. So I just shrugged, my eyes filling with tears. I break things, like the birdhouse window. And I don't know the answers in school. And my drawings are always crooked. It's easier if I just stay quiet. My mother's eyes softened with a look of such deep understanding that it took my breath away. She put the blue mug down on the bedside table and took both of my small hands in hers. Chloe, look at me, she said gently. I lifted my teary eyes to meet hers. Your dad and we get tired, we get stressed, and sometimes we say things we don't mean or we say them in a way that hurts. That is our mistake, not yours. Do you understand that? I nodded uncertainly. She squeezed my hands. Being a person is hard, it's messy, for kids and for grown-ups. But trying to help someone who is sad, that is never, ever making things harder. Do you know what you did for me just now? I shook my head. You brought me a cup of tea, in my favorite mug, even though you were scared. You didn't know if it was the right thing to do. You just knew I was sad, and you tried. This cup of tea, she said, gesturing to the mug, this is not making things harder. This is making things better. This is love. Love isn't about being perfect or getting everything right. It's about showing up and trying. Your trying is the most beautiful thing in the world, Chloe. More beautiful than any perfect birdhouse or straight line. She pulled me into another hug, and this time I cried. I cried for all the times I had made myself small, for all the crumpled drawings in the trash, for the fun games I had refused to play. It was a sad cry, but it was also a cleaning cry, like the rain washing the dust off the streets outside. Later that evening, the rain stopped. A pale, watery sun peeked through the clouds. My dad came home, and the house was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. He and my mom talked for a long time behind their closed door. I don't know what they said, but when they came out, he looked at me, and his eyes were full of a different kind of tiredness. It was a sad, sorry tiredness. He knelt on the floor in front of me. Chloe, he said, his voice thick. The birdhouse. I was wrong. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. I didn't feel angry at him anymore. He just looked sad, and I knew what that felt like. On a sudden impulse, I reached out and gave him a hug. He was so surprised he almost fell over, but then his big arms wrapped around me, and he held me so tightly I could barely breathe. My world didn't change overnight, but the whisper in my head began to fade. The next time I drew a picture, the tower was a little bit crooked, and I just looked at it for a moment, and then I gave it a crooked flag on top, and it was okay. I learned that making mistakes wasn't the same as being a mistake. My mom's words stayed with me. Love wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up with a cup of lukewarm tea, and sometimes that was more than enough.